Some long-time WNBA playoff streaks have come to an end this year. The Seattle Storm and the Phoenix Mercury have been eliminated from the postseason. And I've got Rowan Schaberg on here with me to discuss how these streaks have been broken and what exactly is next for both of these franchises. The Locked On Women's Basketball Podcast. It starts right now.
Ogunbowale for the win. Good!
You are Locked On Women's Basketball. Your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Hello and welcome. You are locked onto women's basketball. I am Jackie Powell along with Barbara Streisand. I am one of your Friday hosts. Yes, I am live from the Barclays Center Media Workroom with my good friend Babs. But anyway, I cover the New York Liberty here at the Next. I help with our social media strategy, and I've covered the sport at many places nationally. We want to thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And remember that Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you by everyone at the Next, not just me, but Rowan as well, who covers the Seattle Storm. And that's going to be very important for today's show. But at the Next, we cover women's basketball all the time, and we tell the stories that need to be told every day. So subscribe now to support our staff that works oh so hard to bring you the coverage that matters oh so much. It's $9 a month and $72 per year. Also, we have been breaking records here at Locked On Women's Basketball. We continue to grow each month, and our listeners, that's you, are helping us get there. So remember, Locked On Women's Basketball is free and available on all platforms, including the YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many more. And today's episode is brought to you all by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more right now. New customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right. Last time you and I were together, dear listener, I had the wonderful and incomparable Michelle Smith on. We talked about the history of WNBA rivalries and where Las Vegas and New York have to get to in order to be amongst that group, that Minnesota and LA group, that Houston Comets and New York Liberty group. But today, we're talking about something a bit different. We're talking about the current fate of the Seattle Storm and the Phoenix Mercury. So those are going to be our first two segments. And then we're going to sort of bring it together in segment 3, talk about sort of how these two situations compare and contrast and what exactly the future holds for both of these franchises. So Rowan, thank you so much for taking some time. You are one of our Seattle Storm experts at the Next. And so I think where I want to start is Storm and sort of how they got to a place where they were eliminated. So I think where I want to start is that game against the Sky where they were up pretty considerably. What sort of happened there?
I mean, it was, if I remember correctly, I think they were up 84-81 with about 3 minutes to go. So, it was looking pretty good. They, like you said, they had been up most of the game. And really what I gathered from, the players and coaches, Sammy Whitcomb just said, we kind of stopped playing the basketball we had been playing the entire game. So not very specific, but, she just kind of said that it felt like they, kind of tried to, really hang on to their lead and maybe focus a little bit too hard on that. So then they just didn't keep playing the basketball that they had been playing the entire game. So what that means, not really sure, but that's kind of the answer that I, heard from them. But it just seems like that fourth quarter and just finishing out games has been really, really difficult for them the entire season. And so that game, that game being the one that gets them out of playoff contention was kind of fitting because, that's happened a lot this season.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It almost sounds like Sammy was saying something along the lines of, we were playing not to lose rather than to win. That's one of those basketball cliches that we often hear. And it was just interesting to me because there was a focus, especially online, on that last play where, you can clarify this for me, but it was Jordan Horston was wide open and she didn't want to shoot it. And so what sort of happened there?
Yeah, it seemed like, it just seemed like a lack of communication there. It was kind of like, they definitely, I'm not sure, getting a shot right there maybe wouldn't have won them the game, but they were within 5 points. So it was that kind of thing with just those final few seconds. You want to get as close as you possibly can and try something. Who knows? Maybe someone could have fouled her. You never know. And it seemed like at least Jewell Loyd was, wanting to just continue and push through to the end and see, if they could even get anywhere closer to Chicago. But then it looked like Jordan Horston. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think Sammy Whitcomb was on the floor too. And they kind of seemed like, oh, okay, well, we had, we missed our opportunity. The game is over. And they, wanted to just hold the ball and wait the clock out. So I'm not really sure, I'd be interested to know what Noelle Quinn's direction was in that moment to know if, what was the plan there. But I can see that was very frustrating to Jewell Loyd because I think she really wanted to try and push through that entire game. And it seemed like her teammates just weren't on the same page about it.
That's really sad. And so I guess it's interesting you said before that it was a little symbolic, this loss of what the entire season has been for the Storm. So I'm just curious if you can just reflect upon how exactly the Storm got to this point, how they got to a point where they are snapping their 7-year playoff, I guess it's not a win streak, it's more a playoff being in the playoff streak.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously that clearly was not the goal of the season. I don't think it ever is. And especially for a team that, held that record until I think, record, I guess you can call it. But, I think now that the Storm hasn't made this playoffs, now I think Connecticut is the team that's made the most consecutive playoffs. And that was a big bragging rights for the Storm was just, look at how we've consistently been, since we drafted Brianna Stewart, essentially, like this is what it's been like. So I think that up until this point, I mean, there was still a glimmer of hope, I think, with the last 10-ish games. When we were looking at the schedule, it's like they're going to play these teams like Minnesota, Phoenix, Indiana that are kind of also trying to get a playoff spot. And so I think those last 10 games were really key for them to really start figuring out what's going on, because if they were to win those games, they actually probably would have had a chance of getting to the playoffs. And so I think that even if they started out the season poorly, which, they did, I think that there was still a glimmer of hope at the end of the season, and losing those games against those teams that are also floating around in the bottom or the middle of the standings would have been really, really helpful for their playoff prospects. And it just didn't go that way. So, you can't get to the playoffs if you can't beat, teams like Indiana, Minnesota, Chicago, Phoenix,
That is true. I guess what I'm wondering is the Storm, there was a year when the Storm sort of shocked us, and that was in 2019. And that was when Sue Bird was out and Brianna Stewart was also out with an injury. So in looking at 2019 and this season, what do you really think, how do they compare, and what was it about 2019 that you really think allowed them to shock some people and that wasn't really able to happen this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at it, while Sue was out, Brianna Stewart was out, I think that there was still that leadership that leadership role was a lot more distributed. And I think that a lot of that team chemistry factor plays a lot into the way that the Storm is playing. You can even see it in that last play against Chicago. Jewell was kind of the one who's like, trying to lead and direct the team there, and, clearly not having the support from some other people in that moment. And, I think looking at the Storm this year, it's like Jewell and, Sammy and, a few other people. But I think that the leadership that Sue brought to the team and that Stewie brought to the team, even, as someone who hadn't been playing there for very long, I think that was really helpful. They just had a lot of other veteran leaders in 2019 that I think were really helpful, who had been in the league and been in positions where they had to step up. And now, Noelle is really relying on rookies to step up in these big moments that they haven't had a lot of experience with.
That's a good point. And remind me, who was the coach in 2019? Was it Dan Hughes, or was it?
It was Dan Hughes. Yes, it was Dan Hughes. Because 2018 and then again in 2020. So yeah, and right, that's also a huge factor. I mean, Dan Hughes, you can just see from his resume just with the Storm and his short few years with the Storm, he just really took that team and and did things that people didn't, like you said, they didn't think that they were going to be capable of doing in 2019. And so that is also slightly a reflection on Noelle Quinn's, coaching this year, which I think some people were quick to, we're a little bit slow to be like, oh, we're not going to criticize Noelle's coaching right now. The team is developing, but, right, when you compare it to someone like Dan Hughes, it's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think 2019 must have been his last full season, right? Because then 2020 was...
He was Garen Kloppenberg, yep. Mm-hmm.
I'm just making sure I've got my timeline.
Lots of coaches going in and out there.
Yes. Coming up, we are going to then take a look at the Phoenix Mercury, who also, and it was on the same night, right? The same night, their 10-year playoff streak. There we go. That's what it is.
Okay.
Snapped. But first, I do want to talk to y'all about our wonderful show sponsor in FanDuel. So, get ready for NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can be on everything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you do not want to miss. And also visit FanDuel to take a look at the money lines, props, and more for the WNBA season and later the playoffs, aka the greatest time of the year. And I think Rowan agrees with me on that. Anyway, so segment 2, here we go. And before actually we get into segment 2, we wanted to thank you again for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day, and remind you that tomorrow our WNBA draft and player development scouting crew are back. They have a new series called WNBA Retrospect, and what they're doing is they are scouting. They're doing historical scouts on the best prospects to ever enter the WNBA in league history in chronological order. And tomorrow they will be breaking down film of one of the greatest defenders in league history in Alana Beard. So stay tuned for that. But now, segment 2, here we go. So let's look at the Mercury. How exactly were they eliminated on that same evening?
That was crazy. That was so crazy. Mariah Jefferson, I believe, was the one who had a last second shot there. They were down 3 points, had the chance to tie it up, and the ball got wedged in the basket. Like, when has that? I feel like I haven't seen that happen in many WNBA games in general, but then for it to happen at that moment, just wow, that was pretty unfortunate for them. But yeah, ball got wedged, and there goes the playoff contention.
Yeah, in segment 1, we were talking all about how for the Storm, when that all went down, it sort of was a symbol of what the season was. And I think you'd have to say the same about the Mercury.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think that it was, just another one of those moments of like, their season has just been so up and down, so unexpected, coaching changes, players, going through waves of having, a good season and a bad season. It just, very up and down for Phoenix. So that was kind of the icing on the cake of, just how crazy their season has been. Really the past 2 years have been for them.
Yeah, and I think you and I were talking about this off air. It almost sort of felt like the pendulum kept swinging in different directions, and you sort of didn't really know what their goals were or what their direction was. It was sort of like when Vanessa Nygaard was still coaching, it was like, yes, we are looking to contend. We are looking to achieve a WNBA championship. And people like me and our fearless leader, Howard Megdal, were a little confused because you look at that roster and you're like, well, Diana's 41. We don't know how BG is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Skylar Diggins-Smith. It's very clear that, there were some tensions there, and she was just going to get her money and then be off.
Mm-hmm.
And she actually opened up about that on Twitter as we saw. But Rowan, what exactly did you feel like was the Mercury's goal, and how do you sort of compare that to what we're seeing with the Storm as well? Because I feel like there's some interesting similarities here when you sort of talk about those expectations.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that at least for Diana Taurasi, the goal is always to be in, championship. Like we all know what her, work ethic and her goals are like. I think the championship is always the goal for her. And so I'm sure that also is for the rest of the team. And like we were saying, I mean, I think with every team, usually they're pretty optimistic about, having that as a goal. And I think, we were saying off air that it seems like the Indiana Fever is the only team that said, this year we are rebuilding, and have said that for a while. And they've been open about that. They're not, really trying to be in playoff contention. They're just trying to be better every year. So I do think that for both teams, it's just been a very confusing kind of thing to have a goal of, but not really doing the steps to kind of get there. And it also doesn't seem like everyone's on the same page. And I think that especially after Phoenix's coaching change, I'm not sure if that should have been the goal necessarily. I think it's kind of like we have a new coach, and we should be building our relationship with this coach. We should be kind of figuring out how we all fit together. And so it seemed like some people were on that page and some people were not. And I would say that the Storm is the same way. I think that they talk a lot about the championship culture in Seattle, with 4 championships. Noelle Quinn's been a part of a few of those, playing or coaching. And I think that is always the goal, and they will say that. But at the same time, I think they needed to be a little bit more realistic when, both teams have so completely changed coaching and player wise. And it's just, both of them have really been kind of up in the air for where the direction is going.
Yeah, I mean, I from my observation, it was sort of like during the off season, we thought that a lot of the moves were indicative of what the expectations would be. I think more on the Seattle side, when you sort of saw like a lot of these players that were either on the fringe, or it was sort of like, okay, we want to see what they have.
Oh, completely.
with the Mercury, I thought the Mariah Jefferson signing was quite brilliant.
Mhm.
And that was what told me that, there's no way that Skylar Diggins-Smith is coming back. Because Mariah Jefferson, she's a UConn point guard. She's also a very selfless point guard. And that just, the pairing with Diana there made sense to me. But I think with the Mercury, I think we can't talk about them without talking about the ownership change. And whenever that happens, there is meant to be some sort of, I guess, discomfort or change or lack of being able to be on the same page when you have things changing as quickly as they are. I mean, okay, as you said, they hire this interim head coach, Nikki Blue, to get them through the rest of the season. And then they hire who is going to be the GM. And so, it's very hard, and we'll discuss this in segment 3, to really know, what direction are they going in? Is she just going to be there to finish out the season, and then Nick Uren is just going to hire who he wants? I mean, it's really hard to know. And I think the other thing about Phoenix that I want to ask you is, and Jesse, our own Jesse Morrison, did some really good reporting on this. Phoenix only seemed capable of winning at home. What exactly is that indicative of? And then I'll ask you a little bit about the fan bases for both, because that's the one thing that hasn't dropped off.
Yes, definitely. I was going to say, I mean, I think that Phoenix's fan base seems incredible. And I think they've shown up really, really well, especially, with BG coming back. I think that that's been huge. And I think that that's drawn a lot of crowds, which I think has been huge for them and has really, kept them going. And, it feels like in years past, there's been some, kind of team chemistry issues. If you're looking at, Skylar Diggins-Smith and even with, Vanessa Nygaard, just things like that I think being at home and having that fan base, it seems to really bring them together a little bit. And their fan base has really shown out, and I think that that's great, but then that has to transfer to on the road as well. You have to be able to win if you want to get into the playoffs. You have to be able to win, at home or on the road. And, a 7-game losing streak, which is what they're currently on, is also not going to be helpful for making the playoffs. So I think that when the initial coaching change, interim change happened, it seemed like they, might be on a pretty good path. I want to say they won the first 2-ish games with the new coach. I'm not sure about that, but just now to see that they're in this really deep losing streak and they just can't win on the road is a really big problem. And I don't know what that speaks to exactly, but that has to be a big factor when you're looking at getting anywhere postseason.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we know, Sandy Brondello was quite a pro at making sure that her teams could win on the road, especially in those single game elimination games. So that takes some special people to be able to do. It's just interesting also going back to the Storm and, their fan base, amid all of the change, the fan base, for the most part, I mean, you've been there, has stuck around as well.
Yes. I mean, definitely you can tell a little bit of an attendance drop off just compared to last year when everyone wanted to see Sue Bird play for the last time. So it feels a little bit different because that was also the first year in the new arena. So it's kind of interesting to see it now a little bit less attended. But for the most part, I mean, the Storm have been kind of at the top of, attendance records, they've been really high up in attendance this season still, and you wouldn't expect that from seeing their records. So that's been huge. I think that it's been a big adjustment period for the entire fan base because a lot of people have never seen the Storm without Sue Bird. So I think it is really, I think it's really impressive how the fans have still continued to show out when there is this unknown, and there are times when, the Storm will get up maybe 5 points and the arena will feel like a playoff environment, even when, you look at their record and you would have no idea. And I think that is amazing. And I think that helps them a lot, not enough to usually finish those games out, because that's usually the time where that energy is really great. But I definitely think it gives them a little bit of a push, and I think that's been huge for them.
Yeah, I pulled up across the timelines yearly attendance, and so the Storm are in third.
Okay.
Their average attendance is 8,834.37.
Okay.
Their high was over 13,000, which I'd assume was the Sioux retirement
Yes.
game.
Mm-hmm.
And their low was 6,894. It's just really fascinating to look at this graph, and I will attach this to the show notes. So that will be linked in the show notes for everyone. But you have the Aces that are at the top. It makes sense that they're the defending champions with 9,127.72. Then you have the Mercury with that 9,093.94. And then in third place, you have the Storm. In that top three, two of those three teams are out of contention, out of the playoffs. I think it's really symbolic of something. And I think that's what we're going to get into in our third segment. What does that mean? And what really should we be looking for in the future with these two franchises? That will be coming up, friends. But first, we'll take a little break. And we are back. I am here with Rowan Schaberg, where we have been talking about sort of what went on this season for the Seattle Storm and the Phoenix Mercury that led to both of them being eliminated and their very long playoff streaks. Phoenix's was a decade long, and the Storm's was 7 years long, almost a decade as well. And so, Rowan, we left off in that second segment talking about attendance and the fact that you sort of see in the top three, it's the defending champions, the Las Vegas Aces, and then it's both the Mercury and the Storm. And I said to you, I said, there's a reason for that, and that is very significant. So I want to ask you why you think that's significant, and then I will give my answer.
Yeah, I mean, that is incredible to see just on paper in that way, that it's like, the Aces you're right, they're the defending champions. It makes sense that they have that attendance. And then you look at teams like Phoenix and Seattle, who are at the bottom of the standings. But I think what's really unique about both of them is that they have both had kind of big events going on that I think have drawn a lot of people. And I think that really it's the beauty of the WNBA there are a lot of people that go for kind of the social aspect, the emotional aspect, seeing Brittney Griner come home, seeing Sue Bird's jersey being retired. I think that a lot of it is that kind of personal connection that the WNBA kind of brings, I think is the reason why fans keep coming back, even if their teams aren't doing well. And I think that a lot of, at least speaking from me talking with Storm fans, a lot of them are like, we know this is going to be a struggle because Sue is now gone. And so we want to come back and keep supporting and show that, even without Sue, we still support the Storm, and we want to make that clear.
I love that you did that reporting, and I love that you spoke to fans. I think that is a very undervalued part of what we do, and I think it's really important. And so I think that's it. I think you see, on the Phoenix side as well, the amount of pomp and circumstance that was put on for Diana Taurasi's 10,000th point. The celebration almost looked like they had won a championship. It was sort of this idea of like, oh yeah, we know we're not going to win a championship, so we're going to give this for Diana. We're going to make her feel as special as she should for the accomplishment. But I also happen to think it represents something a little bit broader, which is, and it connects back to the playoff streak, right? So both of these franchises have been in deep playoff runs or have made it to the playoffs pretty consistently for the past 7 to 10 years. When that happens, fans come. Fans come and fans are engaged. And when that's their expectation, they're going to keep coming.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, what that shows, it's a really interesting point for both of those franchises. It's sort of saying, well, this is the start of a bit of a new era here. The reason that both franchises consistently were in the playoffs and why those attendance numbers were the way they were is because of the players that they had and the iconic names that were attached to the franchises. And so when those leave, this is almost like the residue, especially in Seattle. With the Mercury, they obviously have Diana to hold on to, which it actually brings me to my next point, which is people were discussing on Twitter. They were like, oh, Diana swapped jerseys with Dewana Bonner, her former teammate, Dewana Bonner. What does this mean? Is Diana going to retire after this year? To be clear, via her hoop stats, Diana has another year on her contract. She will be paid the Supermax. I honestly wonder if she were to decide to retire, and this is a good question for our salary cap gurus. Does that money just sort of disappear when a player retires? It's like, oh, okay, so you can use this money for many others. I'm not sure.
That's a great question. I also don't know. That would be really interesting to look at.
Yes, that is a question I will make sure gets answered in the future. But shifting back to Seattle for a moment, and speaking of, those iconic faces, what do you think the chances are that Jewell Loyd decides to stay? She will be an unrestricted free agent. And what did you really learn from her performance this year? Is a team being built around Jewell or being built around Jewell just scoring a lot? Is that really sustainable?
I've been going back and forth about this, like just thinking all about it all season. It's just kind of been this thing that's like been looming over everyone's head a little bit. And when you were talking about, all of the attention that went to Diana for her 10,000th point, I think that that's another thing that the Storm has really been trying to push. Jewell has this, now she just reached 800 points. This is kind of the next big, person, and really trying to push it. And I think that, it's really difficult to have a lot of attention on a player that is scoring so prolifically if the team is also not, supporting in that way. And, without Jewell having such a huge scoring season, I don't know where the Storm would be. I think that she's kind of been that saving grace for them in so many moments. And, even looking back at the game against Chicago just a few days ago, the last 2 or 3 possessions were, Jewell kind of trying to get one of her, super far 3-pointers to get in. And I think that we've also seen that a lot in those final moments, that it's like, yes, Jewell has been scoring so prolifically and been really the Storm's kind of saving grace this season. But at the same time, you can tell that that's not sustainable. There have been games where she's had those looks, but hasn't been able to connect. And I don't think that that's something that should necessarily, that she needs to be doing. I think she needs some support in that. And it feels like she is the kind of person who really likes to challenge herself in that way. So I could see her wanting to stay in Seattle just as kind of a, I want to build this team for kind of back from the ground up and be that person to surround the team around. But at the same time, I think that she needs some other supporting characters with her because she is playing so well. But at the same time, I think she just needs something else. It's not sustainable.
So, if you could share with the listeners who the Storm have signed on for 2024, like would Jewell be enticed to come back with who is coming back?
I mean, I don't really think so at this point. I mean, you have Mercedes Russell is locked in, Ezzy Magmagor is locked in, which I think is huge. They've, Jewell and Ezzy have been playing together really, really well, and they seem to enjoy playing together a lot. You have Kia Nurse locked in, Sammy Whitcomb locked in, and then some other people that are, free agents, Yvonne Turner, Joyner Holmes, who I don't think Jewell would really base that decision off of. But, I think that all of those pieces are enough for her to definitely consider. I think she's close with Mercedes, she's close with Ezzy. They've played really well together, I think. But I think that they need to bring someone else in to really convince her to stay. I think that I think that they need a third person in addition to her and Ezzy to really convince her to stay and feel supported in that role.
Yeah, it's tough because they are going to most likely have a pretty good shot at the number 1 overall pick.
Specifically a point guard. I was going to say, I think having a strong point guard, I think will be a really big convincing factor for Jewell. That just, yeah.
Yeah, maybe not a really good shot at the number 1 overall, because I think Seattle or Indiana has the best odds, followed by Phoenix, I believe, because as we know, the Storm had a very good record in 2022, but they will still have a lottery pick. And a lottery pick is a lottery pick, and these upcoming drafts are going to be pivotal. And so will the idea of, we're going to get someone really talented, does that entice Jewell? We don't really know what she wants for the next step of her career. That is still a bit unknown. And I guess, as you were.
I was just going to say, it's also important, at least I think that if Jewell was to go anywhere else, it would be Chicago. I think the only place that she's ever said she would want to go is back home to Chicago. So that's also important to look at if they have the room, if that's if Jewell is in need of theirs. Like, I think that it feels like if they don't, I don't know why they wouldn't want her, but if they don't want her, don't need her, I think that I don't think she's really looking anywhere else. So that's also something interesting. But I also have been looking at how it played out with Breanna Stewart last season. I think a huge part is knowing what way Jewell is leaning before free agency, because it feels like there were a lot of free agents that the Storm passed up on while waiting for Breanna Stewart's decision. And I think that is something that they are going to really be wanting Jewell to make that decision, to make sure that if she doesn't come back, that they have a group that will at least win them some games and, will get some people, coming to Seattle. So that's also a big factor.
Yeah, I think it's on the Storm to do some internal reflection as well, which, speaking of which, when we look at both of these franchises and going back to Phoenix, as we stated before, they're going to have a new GM in Nick Uren coming in. What expectations should we have for him? Like, it just seems like, I'll ask you.
Yeah, it's so difficult. Like, having a new GM and a new interim head coach come in the middle of the season, and just, it just feels like there are so many unknowns. Like you said, Diana and retiring, who knows what's going to happen with that. And I think that is also a key part. Same thing with what I was saying with Jewell. It's going to be important to know what Diana is doing before, they get to the draft and to free agency, because then he won't be able to kind of figure out what shoes he needs to fill there. And also, I don't know much about him, but I think it's also just important to think about how much coaches also help and work with GMs to figure out what that next step is. And if there's no set in head coach, I think that could also be kind of difficult to have good collaboration to figure out what the future does look like for them.
Exactly. I mean, my expectation would be that he goes out and he puts together a pretty diligent hiring process.
Mm-hmm.
He talks to a lot of candidates. He takes this very seriously. And also, in addition to Diana, it's like they don't know what BG wants. And it's really interesting because it's sort of like, what if BG wants to win and she sees that there isn't really a future for, winning in Phoenix? Like, I am looking at who Phoenix has signed next year. They have Diana, although is she going to retire with the jersey swap with Duana Bonner? Sophie Cunningham is signed. Brianna Turner is signed. Mo Jeff is signed. Michaela Onyenwere is signed. I mean, that is a lot of their core.
Mm-hmm.
And the rookie caddy Sissoko is also signed, but that is not on a protected deal. The rest of them are all protected, if it's a protected vet or a protected rookie scale. But I mean, Phoenix, they are in a position, because their record was not great last year, they are in a position to get a very, very good lottery pick.
Yeah. And I mean, and a lot of the potential draft, I mean, this is a good draft class as well. Like you were saying, the Storm did have a better record last season, so very low chances they will get the number 1 pick. But I mean, in a draft class like this, sometimes it doesn't really matter if you have the number 1 or number 2 or number 3, because it just kind of depends on what the team needs. And it's a pretty hefty draft class depending on who declares for the draft, obviously. But, there are a lot of different options for every position, it feels like.
Yeah, and these are two franchises that just need more talent. They need more raw talent.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'd think, as you were saying before, with two teams that are positioned for the lottery, two teams that are in need of a lot of talent, it would behoove of them to be preparing for that and seeing out of their young players. Like, I think you and I spoke off air with the Storm. It's like, why is Jade Melbourne only getting 7 minutes?
Yeah.
Why is that happening?
Yeah. I mean, playing time has been another factor, closing out games, and just consistency of playing time has just been really bizarre this whole season. It's kind of like, people will go from starting to not playing for months. I mean, Yvonne Turner, she only played about 2 minutes over the span of about a month after she had been starting at the beginning of the season. It's just so up and down. And I think when Gabby Williams, when her injury was announced, there was a lot, Noelle Quinn talked a lot about, we're going to need Jordan Horston and Jade Melbourne to step up and, get more playing time. And I thought Jade did a great job. I think that she, was at the level that she should be, with being a rookie and everything. And so seeing, that last game where she only played about 7 minutes, especially when you're already out of playoff contention. And so that's the time to do this building, and putting her in these situations that she can continue to play and just get more comfortable. It is confusing to see that in the box score.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I'm just looking to see, my idea is that Phoenix has done a little bit of a better job of making sure that their young folks play so that the organization can get a sense of who do they have. And so by looking at courtside here, Caddy Sissoko had 10 minutes. Ashley Jones had 13 minutes.
Wow. Oh, I didn't. I missed that. I completely missed that. Wow.
Well, they have some folks out. I mean, Cunningham, Petty, and Taurasi are out. But I've even found that they have made it a point to play some of their younger players.
And their hardships as well. which is big. Yeah.
Yeah. There's some
not as common.
I mean, listen, I think there are some franchises that really take advantage of hardships and use those players. There are other teams that don't. And I think that is a whole other podcast we can do. But I just, the one last bit I want to harp on before we go is I want to ask you, we sort of talked about the coaching and GMing situation in Phoenix for Seattle. I mean, do you think Noelle Quinn's job is safe?
I mean, it's so difficult when you have rebuilding seasons because on one hand, you want to give the coach a little bit of grace there. So much change. Noelle Quinn has been with the team, whether playing or coaching, for a really long time. And I think an interesting factor to think about is that entire time that she's been involved with the Storm, she also had Sue Bird alongside her as a really strong leader and kind of a second coach in a way, an assistant coach in a way. And so it is really interesting to see, how she is doing, directing the team, taking on, kind of all of the leadership in a way that isn't really on the court in the same way that it used to be. And I think that at the beginning of the season, it was kind of like, okay, seeing what we have, seeing just how the season is going. But now that, like I said, the end of their season had a lot of opportunity for wins, and that didn't happen. And at this point in the season, playing these teams that, are pretty evenly leveled with the Storm and not getting those wins is a little bit of a red flag, especially when all of the games have been so close. And I think that that's huge. I think that the end of the games and the play calling and just the way that they haven't been able to finish out games is unfortunately a really big reflection on coaching, because that's when you kind of need that guidance the most. So in that sense, I would say that it could be a little bit in jeopardy right now.
Yeah, I think so too. I think when she was given that contract extension, it was for 2 years. And this is the final year of that multi-year contract extension. So it's going to be really interesting. These are going to be 2 really interesting franchises for us to look at this fall into the winter and see really what begins to change. But I want to thank you all, listeners, for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And I want to give a huge shout out to Rowan for hopping on the show today. Follow her at Rowan Schaberg on all of the interwebs and read all of her work on thenexthoops.com. Also, tune in tomorrow for the prospect breakdown with our draft and scouting crew. You don't want to miss that. Alana Beard, one of the best defenders
ever. Excited about that.
Yes.
Good.
So this has been Jackie Powell and
Rowan Schaberg.
And we are signing off. Have a great, great weekend, everyone.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.